In this video, I will be showing how to replace the motor mounts on a 2005 Jaguar X-Type 3.0. The tools I will be using is a jack set, a couple pieces of board, this is PVC board, a couple flathead screwdrivers, a pair of channel locks, a number 10 crescent wrench, some sockets with the ratchet specifically 13, 16, 18, 15, 13, and 8, a breaker bar, cheater bar, some WD-40, a impact drill, oil pan, number 17 O-ring, and some European coolant for the Jaguar. The first thing I want to do is take a wedge from a jack set and put it under the back tire, then pull the e-brake to keep the vehicle from moving while I do this. Then I'll take a jack and jack up the vehicle on the frame and get a jack stand in place, because I'll be using this in a bit. I want to jack the vehicle up enough so I can have access to the coolant plug here on the bottom. You have to remove the coolant because you have to remove the coolant hose flange to get to these motor mount bolts. So, using a flathead screwdriver, I will turn this coolant plug counterclockwise until I get a little drip here of coolant. And when I get to that point, I'll take my little catcher here and continue removing the plug so I can catch all the coolant and put the plug to the side just for a bit. And to release this fluid a little quicker, I'm going to remove this top on the reservoir cap. This stops any kind of vacuum from happening and allows the fluid to come out way quicker. After that's done, I'll remove my little pan that I use to catch the coolant and put the plug back in. And I'll just turn this clockwise, righty tighty lefty loosey. And I don't want to turn this too tight. It is an older vehicle, so I just want to fit in there snug. And that should be good. Now, here's the motor mount on the passenger side and the motor mount on the driver's side. And I want to take my new motor mounts and just look at them, compare the two. And they both look pretty good. They should fit just fine. And I'm going to use some WD-40. I'm going to spray all the bolts here, the mounting bolts for the top plate and bottom plate. There's 3 bolts on either side. And this top mounting bolt for the center of that mount on the passenger side, and then the 4 nuts that mount the driver's side motor mount to the engine bay, and the top nut there. Now I need to remove these coolant lines from the coolant hose flange and actually remove that coolant hose flange altogether. So what I do is take some channel locks and I'll remove these hose clamps, and then I'll come in with a flathead screwdriver and dig under the hose just to kind of get it to break its bond that it's had on here. This helps with not damaging the coolant hose, and also helps with not damaging the coolant hose flange, because these things are a little old and that pipe just sits right to the side behind that oil cap. And I'll do the same thing for all sides of the hose. Channel locks to remove the clip, and then take a flathead screwdriver and just dig underneath that hose there and wiggle it off. And then I'll remove this coolant hose flange with the number 8 socket. And again, this is righty tighty lefty loosey. And I've already drained the coolant out of here, but I want to take a little towel just in case there's any residual. I don't want any kind of coolant dropping in. I want to try to catch anything if possible. But luckily everything's dry. And this flange has an O-ring on it. If you look at it, you'll see it's deteriorated. This should always be replaced. Do not put this thing back on without replacing it, because you will have a leak. Now I'm going to put a piece of wood or this PVC board under the jack stand, and I'm going to take an additional jack stand and put it underneath the oil pan with another piece of wood, and then remove my jack and bring it over next to the oil pan. I want to be able to have the car elevated on one side, secured on a stand, but I also want to be able to control the height of the motor with this jack here. Using this wood, this will help to protect the pan from cracking. And now I have complete control, being able to move this engine up and down as I need, because I will need to do that when I put the bolts back in later for the motor mounts. Now I'll use a number 13 socket for the 3 upper motor mount mounting bolts, the upper plate. And then for this center mount, I'll use a number 18 socket, and this is really on there, so I use a breaker bar to get that loose, and then I can take that right out. I left the 3 mounting bolts in place because I like to take an impact drill and just remove them that way. It's quicker for me to do it this way. Obviously, can use just the socket, but I really like having this little impact wrench to do this kind of work. And then I'll go to the motor mount lower plate and use a 15 socket to loosen those up, and then come back with my impact and remove them all the way. Again, it saves time to use this guy here. And you can also use this socket. After I get all 3 of those bolts removed, I can remove the motor mount, and it kind of just slides right between this little reservoir for the washer fluid and the power steering fluid. You just turn it right there. And I can see that this motor mount needs to be replaced. So I'll use the number 18 socket to remove the lower nut from the new motor mount. I use my breaker bar because this thing is on here real nice and tight. And then I'll put that little bracket to the side. And now I'm going to remove the lower nut from the old bracket and motor mount. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to keep the original Jaguar bracket, but also I need both nuts because this new motor mount just has thread coming up from the top, and the original motor mount had a bolt actually going through the top. So I needed to take the nut from both of these and use one on the top and one on the bottom, and they are 2 different sizes. So I'm just going to compare these, and they look exactly the same. So I'm going to take the new motor mount and put it back on the older bracket. And there's this little spacer here that was on there. I'm going to put that back, and then I'll use the nut that I took off from the new mount and put that on there. Get it nice and tight with my ratchet and breaker bar, and then I'll attach everything back and bring this motor mount back into place. Just slip it there. And I did not mark this with a marker where this mount was before, but the engine bay was kind of dirty there, so I just kind of went off of the clean marks and dirty marks where the new motor mount's going to sit with the old plate. You can see there, that's kind of what I went off of. So then I took my 3 mounting bolts and just hand tightened them in place. And as I'm doing that, I'm kind of moving the motor mount bracket around to try to get it back to where it was. And then I'll use my ratchet, tighten these down, come in with my breaker bar, and get them fully tightened. And then I'll take my top mounting bracket with the bolts already inserted and kind of just rest it where it's going to go. And to put this center nut in place. And then I'm going to jack up the engine here with the jack that I previously put in place. This is so that I can actually get the upper bolts for the upper bracket in place correctly. Otherwise, you could end up stripping out the threads, and them going misaligned when they go in. After I get them hand tight, I'll come in with my ratchet and start tightening with the ratchet. And then once I get them feeling pretty good, I'll take my impact. This helps me save time again. Just use impact and then come in with the ratchet and the breaker bar to get them real nice and tight. And then I will tighten the center nut here. I'll use my breaker bar to get that nice and tight. And that is the first motor mount done. Now we have this coolant hose flange and got to replace this O-ring. Now I had to try to find this O-ring. I finally came across a forum that had this O-ring. People said they bought from Home Depot. It's a number 17 1/16 outside diameter. And since I put this in, I have had no issues at all. And you can kind of eyeball this to see if it matches up. And it does, so that just goes right on there. And then I'll put this coolant hose flange back in place, tighten it down with the number 8 socket, and then just reattach all the hoses and put the clamps back in place. Just basically the reverse of what we did to take everything out. And now I'm going to take all my jack set and stands, the whole assembly, remove everything from the passenger side and bring them over to the driver's side, because I will need to have the same type of setup on the driver's side where I have the car jacked up a bit and I have the ability to jack the engine up as I need. And you see I use the board here. I have this new motor mount. I'm just gonna look and you see there's 4 nuts, 1 center nut. So first I'm gonna remove this battery cover. This is an older car. It didn't have any kind of bolts or anything. There may be some clips, additional steps you need to take. Now I'm gonna remove this coolant hose using my channel locks, remove this clip, and then use my flathead screwdriver and then put a towel under here to try to catch any residual. Put that to the side, and there's this back hose here. Someone put a newer clamp that you hand tighten, and then I have this bolt. I'm gonna use my number 10 crescent on to remove this mounting bolt for the reservoir. And this reservoir does not just pop right up. You actually have to turn it counterclockwise. And it actually is being held by a little clip on the back side. So I'll take this wire from the front so that I have the ability to remove this whole entire reservoir. And as I turn this, a little bit of coolant comes out. So that's a good thing to put the towel down. And you can see on the bottom here, this little clip here, as you're turning this counterclockwise, it actually needs to come out of that little metal piece, that bracket kind of holding it in place. So do not force this thing out. And now I'm going to remove some of this wiring out of the way and come in with my number 15 socket. And I'm going to break open all of these mounting nuts. Use my breaker bar. These things on here real tight. And after I get those broken, I'm gonna use my 13/16 socket and break the center nut loose. That thing was on there real good. So this center nut actually has a motor mount bracket arm attached to it. I'll get to that in a minute. I'm gonna come with my impact and remove the 4 mounting nuts on all the outside of this motor mount. Put those to the side. And now you can see down here, this is a motor mount bracket arm. It actually goes from that motor mount to the engine here. And there's 2 number 13 bolts that need to be removed. They're actually in there really tight, so I use my breaker bar to get those apart. And you can see in here it's a pretty tight area to work in, so I had to really take my time. Get both of those things broken loose. And after a little bit of time, I was able to get both of those bolts loose, and then I could turn them with my hand. I didn't want to lose these things in the engine bay. This arm slides right out. The orientation of this only goes one way. You have a flat side on the front, and you slide that to the engine bay to get that on there. Now I'm going to remove the motor mount. It has this little spacer on the top, and then you kind of just finagle this right out of place like so. And you see this one is worn out as well, so good time to replace this. And I'm going to slip the new one in. Just kind of take your time, move some of these wires out of the way. It should go in pretty easily. And after I get that positioned, I will go ahead and tap this down. Because the motor at this point has shifted a bit, I'll have to kind of use my force here to get that to sit where it needs to sit. And then I'll put my spacer back on top and come back with my motor mount bracket arm. And the orientation goes in one way, so you come from the back of the car to the front of the motor, and then get these bolts in. Again, it's a tight space. It takes a little bit of time to kind of get these in, but it can be done. After I get those hand tight, I'll come in with my 13 socket again. Get those nice and tight with the breaker bar as well. And those should be good to go. Now I got those two bolts back in. I will put on my center motor mount nut. And I'll use my 13/16 socket to get that tight. And as I'm doing that, I'm going to also shift the motor a little bit by hand. And then I'm going to use my breaker bar to get that real tight. And now I'm going to come in with my number 15 socket for the 4 mounting nuts that go on the outside of the motor mount. And I'll get those hand tight, use my socket to tighten them up a little more, and then come with my impact wrench, get those down pretty snug. And then I'll come with my breaker bar and get all 4 down real tight. So now it's time to put all this wiring back in place. It has these little clips here. And then remember, this little clip on the back side kind of sinks into that bracket in the back. So this all needs to sit as one assembly, all needs to fit in place, and you have this top as well, has this kind of design indent that also needs to match on top of where the shock is for the driver's side. So you kind of put this in place and then turn it clockwise. Make sure everything's going in the right way. And I'll reattach this mounting bolt on the side. Use my number 10 crescent. Connect this tube. Put that wire back in place. And this back tube as well. Make sure put the clips back in place to keep these things secure. And now we have both motor mounts done. Put this battery cover back in place, and then remove my jacks and jack stands. And there's one final step to the process. Since we have already drained the coolant, we need to add new coolant. Get the correct coolant for your vehicle, because if you do not, you could have some issues. So this is pretty simple, straightforward. Go ahead and pour the coolant into your reservoir as high as you can without it overflowing. You might want to get a rag or something to catch any spillage that might happen. So we are above the minimum line. Now this coolant will not go down all by itself. you actually have to start the vehicle and run it for several minutes. So we'll get the vehicle started. As I'm doing that, I'll move the wedge from behind the vehicle. That's to not forget. That's something that's easy to forget. As the vehicle's running, I'll periodically check for any kind of leaks. And then I'll open up the reservoir cap, and this will help the coolant go into the system and work its way through, and also check the temperature from time to time. Now you can see this fluid is dropping. The pump is working right now to push that through the reservoir and into the coolant hoses and radiator. And as that drops, I will add more coolant until I get to the very end of that jug. And you can see here that we're at that minimum mark. So I let the engine run for a little bit longer, just to double check, make sure we're not dropping too much further past that, and then come back and check for any leaks that could have occurred. We have no leaks, so we're good. I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe.